First of all, welcome all of you to our SINU and Australia seminar series, and a special welcome to our speaker this morning, Dr. Pete Connolly. Let me also just say that I value very much the opportunity for the university to be promoting free and fair and flowing speech, as we do have a responsibility to promote ideas, and we are the only venue. This is the only institution in the country where we have an opportunity to be able to come and exchange and share views. I value very much the role that the university plays in the social and economic fabric of our society and community. And we used to have a very vibrant SINU Talk Story Forum, which many of you, my colleagues here, will recall last year when I took up the position. I encouraged us to promote and actually have at least one public forum each month as a means of promoting ideas, as a means of creating that space in the capital where our students and the members of the public can come together and share ideas and know about what's happening in an objective way. So this is very much part of that forum. I also want to emphasize that this is a SINU initiative, and we will, over the course of the next few months, be inviting and encouraging other speakers from our other embassies to be able to share with us some of the perceptions that they have about their role, the importance of the partnership that we have with them. I'd like to thank our partnership with Australia in providing this series, which I fully support, because I value the importance of us being able to share different ideas from different parts of the region and different parts of the world. And so this morning, I'd like to welcome you, Pete, to SINU. I've known Pete for a while when he was colonel in the Australian Army, and he gave me the opportunity to address 300 soldiers, I think, military personnel at the Australian Defence Academy on the role of humanitarian intervention. So this morning, Pete is going to be speaking to us about his research on the Chinese interest in Melanesia. And I'd like to preface my introduction by saying that, and I've always emphasized this point, that we must also appreciate that in the Pacific and here in the Solomon Islands, Chinese interests span more than 100 years. We tend to forget the interest and the involvement of Chinese in Solomon Islands. And we tend to look at the lifespan of the interest in terms of the lenses of the recent geostrategic interest in politics within the region. But all of us here grew up very closely with Chinese traders, buying our copra, selling in the villages. So I'd like to start off and preface that for us in Solomon Islands and many countries in the Pacific, there has been a very long-standing relationship that has transcended the most recent political strategy. And I think it's very important for us to realize and appreciate and understand that there's a level of community integration that we've always had with Chinese, in particular, and Chinese traders. And so it's important for us to bear that in mind, that interest is far more, it goes beyond the simple strategic and political discourse that we're having in more recent times. But without saying much, I look forward to your presentation, Pete, today, and the research that you've done here in Solomons and also in Papua New Guinea on China's interest in Melanesia. And of course, I look forward to the questions that will be generated from them. Please, Peter, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Transform, for your kind words, and thank you all for being here today. really appreciate this wonderful audience that we have here. I'd also like to thank the Dean of the Faculty of Education and Humanities, who kindly hosted me for a discussion with her faculty last year in October. And as a result of a discussion, a bit like what we're going to have today, some of her staff proposed that I make an address to a much wider audience, particularly to the students of the university. No one was available at the time because you were doing exams. So it's great to be back here and to actually deliver on that idea that I believe was the Dean at the time was keen to see happen. So thank you all for the opportunity. I'd also like to just note that I'm honoured to have some representatives from the PRC embassy here today. It means a lot to me because a lot of my work has been trying to understand Chinese perspectives, and I think it's incredibly important to have that representation here today. I also note that in my words and my remarks and my analysis, I represent nobody but myself. I have formerly worked for the Australian government. I don't now. This is my own work from my PhD. So what I'd like to start by talking about is just the journey that I went on when I started doing a PhD with what's now called the Department of Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University 10 years ago. At the time, I had some involvement with various countries in Melanesia, and one that had always caused a question in my mind was in the year 2000. Yes, I am quite old. In the year 2000, I was sent as a reasonably young army officer to sit on a ship just off Honiara in Iron Bottom Sound. And it was because of the troubles that were happening here, and at the time there was a concern that there might be a need to evacuate people if the troubles got bad. Now, luckily, they never got that bad that we had to get involved. So I got to sit on a ship for a month, and I didn't really get to come and meet the people of Honiara, sadly. But an interesting data point from that time was when you're in the army and you have to do an evacuation, they give you a list of all the people you can expect to have to protect and get onto your ship or onto planes. And I got a very long list on the first day that I was sitting on the ship, and it was all, lots of expats, lots of Australians, New Zealanders, Europeans. And the next day I got another list that was much, much longer, and every name on it was Chinese. And to me, that was fascinating. I had no idea there was so many Chinese people in Solomon Islands. But the thing that really raised questions for me is, so that means if I've been given this list that the government of China has asked for Australia to do the evacuation if necessary. And I guess that led me to a whole series of questions which 14 years later led to the beginning of my PhD thesis, because I wanted to understand this involvement. And as Professor Transform said, part of that story then was from 100 years before, of several generations of old Chinese who had become part of various nations in the Pacific, were part of Papua New Guinea, part of Solomon Islands, part of Vanuatu. And that was originally what my research was about, because that was what was here, if that makes sense. As I started to move into my research, I started to discover other things. And I guess at about the time I started, quite coincidentally, it was a time when Xi Jinping had just taken the reins in China and had proposed this great strategy or scheme, which was originally called the One Belt, One Road, and then for international audiences became known as the Belt and Road Initiative. And so a lot of my research at the beginning was trying to understand, what does this mean? What does it mean to Chinese people? And what does it mean to people in other countries? And I note that all of my case study countries, none of them were on the Belt and Road at the time. So then as things started to develop, and each of those countries came to join the Belt and Road Initiative, I was in this great position to understand where things had been and then how things changed as China, the state, became far more engaged in those countries. And that's really what my PhD research was about. So on the map, I've got coloured in the case study countries that I did my research in. You can see there's 5 of them. The 4 independent states of Melanesia, plus Timor-Leste, and I'll get to why that was later. And obviously China as well. And within China, 2 very important provinces where many of the old Chinese had come from, and many of the modern Chinese who are involved in these countries come from as well, Fujian and Guangdong. And over a period of roughly 5 years, I spent a lot of time both in China and those 5 case study countries doing interviews and coming to understand those 6 different sets of perspectives. And I did that through what I refer to as 297 different research interactions. 217 of those were one-on-one interviews. And about a third were with people talking about China, about a third with Papua New Guinea, and about a third with the other countries, is roughly how that set worked out. But it's really that information and that understanding that I draw on for my analysis that I'm going to talk to you about today. So in the course of my research, I had a number of great opportunities. Firstly, in 2014 in China. Back then, as I said, I was still serving as an army officer, and I had the privilege of being sent to Beijing for a conference that was run by the People's Liberation Army, the 17th International Symposium, where I really got to understand the Chinese perspective on where things were at strategically for them at the time. But also there was many representatives from around the world. I was the Australian representative. But that kind of positioned me to understand a lot of things that I might not have if I hadn't had that opportunity at the time. I then, over the next 4 years, had times when I went back to China. I went back as a researcher, and I ended up in both Beijing and in Guangzhou doing a range of interviews. And in particular, I spoke to a number of fairly senior Chinese academics about their perspective on where China was in the world and how its relationship with the Melanesian states was developing and what China's interests were. And once again, having that background to understanding that Chinese perspective was critical to then understanding what I saw on the ground in the Pacific. The other thing that I got from the research, and particularly around that time frame, was doing a lot of work in Papua New Guinea. I came to know a lot of people that were really at the grassroots of society. I had other great opportunities to speak to people who were the secretaries of departments in a number of different countries, particularly in Papua New Guinea, but also from Solomon Islands, Fiji, Timor-Leste and Vanuatu. But the opportunity to speak to people at the grassroots allowed me to understand how even within the one country, or even within the one part of the one country, there was different levels of interest and different perspectives depending on what level you're in, which to me was an important part of understanding this overall situation. The other thing I should say is that having described the research, it was obviously a kind of a qualitative research using mixed methods. for those of you who are learning about this stuff at the university at the moment. And what those 297 research interactions allowed me to do as I watched the changes of China's interactions within Melanesia over that long period of time, allowed me to do a thing that's called a dynamic comparison. For what it's worth, an academic term. And just to wrap up on the research itself, eventually we were all confronted by COVID, and unfortunately that meant I couldn't go to places and interview people face to face as much as I'd like to. So I went into a stage where I used to just interview people on WhatsApp to finish off my research. But in the end, it had been about 8 years of understanding people's perspectives and observing change that led to my understanding of what had changed in terms of China's interests and its interactions with Melanesia over that period of 8 years. And that's what brings me here to talk to you today. Of course, there's a lot of literature that you have to look at for a PhD, and I just want to call out a couple of key pieces. One of the first things that I read back in 2014 was an incredibly important reference, which I'm sure a lot of you know, which is Apelli Halfa's work. And in particular, there's one of his essays that really meant something to me, and that was Our Sea of Islands, which I think he wrote in the 80s, but the version I have was published in 1993. And there was something that he said in that stuck with me throughout my whole research journey. And that was, he described the Pacific as a region with 2 levels of operation. The first of these was that of national governments and regional and international diplomacy, in which the present and future of Pacific Island states are planned and decided upon. The second was that of ordinary people, who, because of the poor flow of benefits from the top, tend to plan and make decisions about their lives independently, sometimes with surprising and dramatic results that go unnoticed or ignored from the top. And he goes on to say, whilst far beneath the top exists that other order of ordinary people who are changing their world in accordance with their perceptions of their own interests. And I think that sentiment, which is from over 3 decades ago, is incredibly important to all of us now, particularly at a time when in the Solomon Islands you're preparing to have your next national election, which is through democracy the way that the ordinary people get to make a decision about the future of their country. But apart from Apelli's great contributions, I'll just call out a few others. David Baldwin's work on statecraft is kind of the basis for how I talk about statecraft. There's some great Chinese literature, which I was privileged to read in English. And I should have said at the beginning, my apologies as I go through this for my pronunciation of Chinese words and Chinese names. I'm not a trained linguist. My apologies if for those of you who are Mandarin speakers, if I don't quite get the pronunciation right. But in terms of Chinese literature, there was a number of books that were quite important to me. And one was written by Professor Wang Yizhou, who talked about a concept called creative involvement. And this was around the 2012, 2014 timeframe. I had the privilege of having a great discussion with Professor Wang at one stage. But then there was also contributions from Professor Yu Ji and a number of academics at Sun Yat-sen University down in Guangzhou that just helped me to understand the situation better than I would have if I hadn't had those opportunities. And finally, there was some very interesting work done by a French academic who lives in the States called Nadège Roland. And she wrote extensively about what she researched, and she was a good Chinese linguist, so she read strategic papers in Mandarin to do her analysis. But her view of the Belt and Road Initiative back at the beginning, around the 2017 timeframe, I think her analysis was very strong and has proven to be quite correct. But before I get into talking extensively about what I found, I've just put on the screen some definitions. Now, I don't know for the people right up the back whether your eyesight's probably much better than mine. I hope you can read those. But in case you can't, I'll do a quick summary. And that's firstly the term statecraft. When I talk about that, I'm referring to the goal-oriented employment of an instrument of state power. And this is something that every country does. Some do it better than others. In the West, that's often referred to as DIME, as in diplomacy, information, military and economic forms of power. But when talking about Chinese statecraft, most academics refer to three different areas, and that's political, economic, and security. And when I say political statecraft, that's including diplomacy, propaganda, and united front work, which, from what I can see, have become very closely associated with each other in the new era. They're virtually in lockstep, and I think it's fair to look at them as part of a system. And when I talk about security, I talk about police very much as well as military as part of a system. And then in terms of grand strategy, quite simply, it's the comprehensive employment of all of that national power to achieve long-term goals. Once again, this is something that most countries do. It's just a question of how you go about it. There's choices to be made. Now, moving on to the Belt and Road Initiative that I've mentioned already, it did seem to become quite central to my understanding for my thesis. But interestingly, when I first spoke to people in China in 2014 and even in 2017, and when I first spoke to people in the Pacific, including secretaries of departments in most countries in 2017, on both sides, no one could really see the Belt and Road Initiative connecting with the Pacific. Interestingly, and kind of belatedly, there was a route added to the overall plan for the Belt and Road in 2017 that kind of tacked on the Pacific Islands. And you can see it on my map there. This actual bit here, at the time, I had to draw in myself because the diagram had that route stopping pretty much in the Philippines, which didn't quite work for my purposes. But it was interesting to see how people didn't think that link was going to happen until that time in 2017 when it did. And the perspective largely from Chinese academics was, well, if this is about an economic win-win proposition, that's kind of more in the Pacific Islands' interests, less in China's. There's not as much economic benefit for China to do this. When I spoke to officials in the Pacific Islands, they virtually said the same thing to me. They said, hey, we can see the economic benefit for us, particularly in terms of, in a developing country, if we have the chance to get cheaper infrastructure, why wouldn't we take that? That makes sense to us. However, we don't think the Chinese will want to come here because we don't represent as much economic benefit to them. So it was just interesting that at around that time, that was how people seemed to be thinking from my interviews. Nevertheless, within a year, the Belt and Road had very much arrived in the Pacific. And we'll talk more about how that happened in a minute. But the first country to join the Belt and Road in the Pacific was Papua New Guinea. they were moving towards a very big, hosting a very big world forum for APEC in 2018 and desperately needed some financial support. And at this point, they looked to China. And in June 2018, Prime Minister Peter O'Neill signed a Belt and Road Initiative MOU with Xi Jinping. And that was the beginning of the Pacific's involvement in the Belt and Road Initiative. But just to talk about the character of the Belt and Road as I've come to understand it, firstly, and this really kind of starts with Nadège Rolland's work, but looking at what I've then seen on the ground, it's a geo-economic strategy. And geo-economic is a term that means the use of economic tools to achieve outcomes that are not economic, quite simply. And I think it's a very well thought out one. But secondly, it's an incredibly important narrative for China because, as discussed earlier, most countries that are developing nations saw a great interest in engaging with this program because of the prospect of what they saw as cheaper infrastructure. And that has been quite a compelling argument. And that's led to the scale of the Belt and Road now. When I last counted, it was 146 countries. It's probably a bit over that now. But that's a large number of the world's nations, and it includes virtually all of the developing nations in the world. But furthermore, in terms of narrative, once a country has decided to join the Belt and Road, it then becomes a useful narrative for the introduction of extra statecraft, extra means into that country. And finally, in terms of a framework, and particularly when you look at it from the perspective of the Chinese ambassador in a given country, and he has direction, there's things that he has to try to achieve, this is the perfect framework for him to get his job done, for the combination of those different types of statecraft to achieve long-term goals. And so, to me, the Belt and Road is all three of those different things. It's a strategy, it's a narrative, and it's a very important framework. Now, what I'm going to do is talk in some detail about each of those three different areas of statecraft and how I saw them become introduced or increased in Melanesia over the time frame of 2014 to 2022. The first being political statecraft. On the screen, there's a few notable Chinese ambassadors from that time. And the reason that I've put them up there is because of the significance of their appearance in those countries and what they managed to achieve for China in the time that they were there. Interestingly, and this is particularly talking to ambassadors from other countries when I was doing my research, they tended to notice this generation of new ambassadors that came into the kind of South Pacific and into Melanesia around 2017 were of a vastly higher quality than the people that had gone before them. And just I'll talk about some examples to start with. The top left picture is Ambassador Chen Bo with the Prime Minister for Fiji, Frank Bainimarama. Chen Bo arrived, I think it was around May 2017, which was a bit over a year before Fiji joined the Belt and Road Initiative, and solidified what was at the time China's strongest relationship in the Pacific. He worked through many different challenges over a long period of time, and interestingly, he spent about 5 years there. He was, in my view, seen as the safe pair of hands by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was a guy they could trust to get the job done, and they left him there for a lot longer than most ambassadors get to do. Since then, as a demonstration that he succeeded, he's been promoted to being a regional envoy, and he's China's regional envoy for the Pacific. So moving on from him, over to the right-hand side of the screen, if you just see in the centre, on the right-hand side, that's Ambassador Shui Bing talking to Prime Minister Peter O'Neill in Papua New Guinea. He arrived about the same time as Chen Bo did in Suva, but he really did make some waves as an ambassador. Incredibly intelligent, great experience, great background, seemed to really be a very professional engagement specialist who managed to convince and lay the groundwork for the first country in the Pacific to join China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I think he was credited with an amazing effort from Xi Jinping. And of course, when he got through not only doing that, but helping China to help Papua New Guinea with APEC in 2018 and the various other geopolitical achievements that China made off the back of that important engagement, Shui Bing was then promoted to be a regional envoy himself, and he got sent to the Horn of Africa to be China's representative for the region. So those two ambassadors were the first two who had caused a lot of consequence, and both were recognised for their work by being promoted out of those jobs. And then the bottom left of the screen is one that most of you probably are far more aware of, which is Ambassador Li Ming. He was sent here in 2020, about a year after Solomon switched recognition to Beijing. And there's an interesting thing about Li Ming, which I think has continued to appear in every ambassador in their CVs since then, is that Li Ming came here having been the Deputy Director General of a division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, I don't know in detail how things work within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but I can only guess. And I believe that to be the Deputy Director General of a division, and there's only so many of those in Beijing, you've got to be pretty high quality. You've got to be one of the A team. You understand the strategy, and you are a trusted agent for the party. And so when he was working there, and I know the division that he was in was, I think it's called North America and Oceanian Affairs, which includes the Pacific. I imagine that he was, if not just aware, but possibly working very hard on the situation that led to Solomon Islands switching to recognise Beijing. He then got sent forward to make it work and to make it so. That's my impression. And obviously had great success in his time. And on his watch, there was many developments here, which we'll talk about later under security. Just to finish off on the political statecraft side of things, I've talked about a couple of key ambassadors. I'd note that each of them has now been replaced. The people who have replaced them were also a Deputy Director General when they were in the MFA before they came to their posting in the Pacific. Possibly not just before becoming an ambassador, but maybe 2 posts before. But each one of them have that there in their background. And in the generation before them, there was none that have been Deputy Directors General. So I think that's an important indication that when I started my research, I was being told that really China didn't have a strategic priority for the Pacific. But when you look at that data point, you wouldn't send your highest quality here and then continue to send it unless there was a high strategic priority. And I think your country is part of that priority. Now, I said before that political statecraft also includes propaganda and United Front work. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but I can discuss it in question time if anyone wishes to. Now, economic statecraft, probably the most important element of statecraft because it started long before everything else, but it started at a fairly low level. The first Chinese state-owned enterprise that I'm aware of in Melanesia is now known as Covec, which is, I believe, a subsidiary of China Rail, and has become a very well-established state-owned enterprise in Papua New Guinea, having entered there around about 1995. But over time, in the late 90s, as going out started for China, and then into early this century, a number of more Chinese state-owned enterprises started coming in to Melanesian countries, in particular Papua New Guinea. And over time, that had risen to a point where, particularly in Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu and Timor-Leste, when I was doing my research there, kind of 2014, 2017, it seemed to me that their construction sectors had that many Chinese companies in them, they couldn't take any more. And this is before the Belt and Road arrived, I might add. So it was of great interest that when I returned to Papua New Guinea in 2019, a year after that country had joined the Belt and Road, I found how much its economic statecraft representation from China had changed in that 1 year. And this was Chinese people that told me about it in some really interesting discussions. But basically, the number of state-owned enterprises or major state-owned enterprises from China in Papua New Guinea had gone from 20 in 2018 to 40 in 2019. So it had doubled. And that to me was fascinating because, as I said, I didn't think there was room for any more when there was 20. And yet we've gone up 100%. And as I had the privilege of having discussions with Chinese state-owned enterprises and with a few other representatives of the Chinese business community, I found out how that had worked and how it was playing out on the ground. One of the biggest, the most interesting facts that I found was where the amount of Chinese aid contribution to Papua New Guinea in particular had become quite high in around the 2016, 2017 timeframe. By the time I was there in 2019, it was really dropping off. But at the same time, there was a lot of money coming in to pay for projects that were being built by Chinese companies. That a lot of that money was coming by now from multilateral banks. And what I'm talking about is banks like the Asian Development Bank, the ADB, or the World Bank. And talking to a number of Chinese businessmen, I found out how that worked in terms of the tender process. Generally, you would have some leading Chinese state-owned enterprises who would make incredibly low bids because they could afford to and they were that competitive. And generally that was described, and this is by some Chinese businessmen, as 30 to 50% below the engineer's price. Now, clearly, if a company can do that, most other companies cannot. And that means that they've almost got the market cornered. But then, what I found really interesting was that the Chinese state-owned enterprises were competing with each other that hard. They'd identify, I'm here to get the money instead of him, or I want to be better than that company. They would then have subsidiary companies that made lower bids. So it's like, trying to outdo the depth they could get to. Now, I'd say in some cases that meant they won the Asian Development Bank bid. It didn't mean that was going to be the final price, because clearly you couldn't build it at the price that they had managed to get the contract at. And sometimes over time, the cost would change and there'd be overruns and it would increase. But there really did seem to be a domination, particularly with the Asian Development Bank, of those contracts. And I then obviously went to the ADB to ask them some questions and said, so how does this work? Why is this so? And they said, oh yeah, I'd say at the moment, this is 2019 in Papua New Guinea, 80% of our infrastructure projects have Chinese state-owned enterprises delivering them around the country. And that included a really important one, which is the Highlands Highway project, which was to construct highways connecting across the country, which is pretty difficult in Papua New Guinea. And there was 9 different projects happening at the time, and every one of them, 100%, had Chinese state-owned enterprises on them. Now, interestingly, I had the privilege of talking to some Chinese officials at various times, and they had said to me when I asked the question, what is a Belt and Road Initiative project? They had said, well, it can be a lot of things, but it must fit within what they call the 5 connectivities. And when I looked at those 5 connectivities, and it could just be my understanding, but they seemed very broad. There was an infrastructure connectivity, there was a finance connectivity, there was a people-to-people connection connectivity. So it seemed to me like virtually any project could fit within the 5 connectivities. And I then asked this particular official, so what if it's not being paid for by China? Does it still qualify as a Belt and Road Initiative project? And he said, absolutely. And the impression I got from the state-owned enterprises was, in fact, there's a preference to have that money being contributed to what's seen as a Belt and Road Initiative project come from a multilateral source. So if the Asian Development Bank is paying for a project, that means that China is not paying for it. But at the same time, everybody in the country sees that Chinese company building this beautiful new road or this infrastructure and see it as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and therefore China has brought this to us. So it's an interesting little point there. And I guess in this country, just to set the record straight, a lot of the projects that China has delivered in the first 4 to 5 years since the switch have absolutely been paid for by China, Exim Bank most likely. And that's kind of how it's worked in other countries to start with, but then over time, as that money kind of falls off, it becomes more ADB or World Bank that's paying for those projects. And I think there's now some good examples here in the Solomons of some major projects being financed by the Asian Development Bank, including the project for the port, which I think was won by CCECC in March last year. That is an Asian Development Bank project, as an example, and there are others. Just to put some names to faces from my slide, I should have done this at the beginning. The guy at the top left is the Economic and Commercial Counsellor, or he was, I'm not sure if he still is, for the PRC in Papua New Guinea. His name is Lu Lin Lin. And the 2 people below him is firstly the General Manager for China Harbour Engineering Company in Papua New Guinea. And at the bottom, the gentleman on the left is the General Manager for CCECC, or China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation. And I'd say those 2 companies are probably China's 2 biggest state-owned enterprises in this sub-region at the moment. They're delivering a vast amount of the infrastructure capability, but also they're generally involved in things that are of great interest to the Chinese state. So they're probably the 2 most important ones. The impression that I got was that there was a relationship of coordination when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative between the Economic and Commercial Counsellor and the key state-owned enterprises that are delivering the most important pieces of infrastructure in a given country. And that's the same in Vanuatu, and I imagine it's the same here in the Solomon Islands as well. The one thing I did leave out with economic statecraft that I can talk about later is resources. There clearly is some important resource interests for China in Melanesia. The majority are in Papua New Guinea, but there are some important ones in this country as well. And once again, we can come back to that. Now, finally, to come to security statecraft. As I said, this involves more than the People's Liberation Army. It's also the Ministry of Public Security or the Chinese police. And you have some of them in this country now. Before the Belt and Road arrived in Melanesia, the security cooperation relationships that China had with Pacific countries were very small. They generally consisted of occasionally delivering some stuff that could be used by a military force or a police force, and people going for courses in China. And the occasional ship visit, or people would come out to visit. But as a result of the Belt and Road, there was a slow uptake in Chinese security cooperation, and it really came home a few years after everyone joined the Belt and Road in around about 2020. So right at the end of that year, as we were all kind of hulled down because of COVID, locked in our homes, a couple of defence attaches arrived, and that was firstly a senior colonel arrived in Port Moresby, and another one in Suva, and then eventually one in Nuku'alofa in Tonga as well. And over time, those gentlemen received a deputy, a kind of lieutenant colonel to back them up. And that was an important change because firstly, China had been promising it would do it for 15 years, and those countries have been saying, come on, we sent you an attaché, when are you going to send one to us? Because it's an important way of making a security cooperation relationship more permanent. And by having a defence attaché there, it means that if China delivered a piece of equipment and there was problems with it, then you've got a person there who can make it good, or who can fix it up. So an important development for China to have that permanent presence there from the kind of 2020, 2021 timeframe. But then as time went on, there was a number of other developments. And the first of those was just after the riots occurred here in late 2021. So we're moving into early 2022, the arrival of a detachment of police advisors who are referred to as the police liaison team. Now at the time there was about 9 of them, I believe. That number has changed over time, but it was the first example of such a deployment into the Pacific. And they came to do some training with the RSIPF, but over time it established that they weren't going to leave, and they're now on their 4th rotation. The other thing that I'd add is that the gentleman who was in charge of that group, who at the time was a guy called Commissioner Zhang Guangbao, I hope I've got that pronunciation right, he didn't leave with the first rotation, he stayed on. And I believe he was here for almost 3 rotations. But I'd say he's more like what I'd expect from a defence attaché in those other countries that have a military. He's kind of the police equivalent, in my mind anyway, who's able to work closely with the ambassador to coordinate security statecraft in that country and make sure that it's integrated with the other forms of statecraft to meet China's strategic intent. Now, I'll just add quickly onto that more recently, towards the end of last year, there was a similar police liaison team turned up in Vanuatu and another one in Kiribati. And each of those, even though they were just there to do a scoping visit, they've stayed on, and they're now in their 2nd rotation as well. And each one of them has a leader who I believe works closely with the embassy. So I think that's a really important direction that Chinese security statecraft has taken in the Pacific just in the last 2 years. And the Solomons has been an important part of establishing that. With the police on the ground, they're probably far more capable of achieving influence than, say, a defence attaché sitting in his defence attaché's office, because the police are engaged with the population, they're engaged with the rule of law, but they're also working on security issues. The other thing about security statecraft is this whole thing about bases that keeps popping up in the media, particularly in Western countries. As soon as someone mentions Chinese bases, people get so excited. It's hilarious. But I just want to give you a bit of background as to what that probably looks like and what it means, as opposed to what gets reported in the press, because it's not necessarily that accurate when we see it in the press. And just to take you back into the depths of a piece of my thesis, there was a great debate within China that really started around the time of 2001 is where I'd put it, just on how to change the direction of China's grand strategy. And there was a guy, I've just got a quote here, a major general called Liu Yazhou, who wrote an amazing article called The Grand National Strategy. And he said in there exists on the South China Sea periphery a crisis arc that extends from the Philippines through Indonesia and from there to the Solomon Islands. And he goes on to say, we should map out strategies for the fragmented zone, which is how he refers to the crisis arc, and the loose and scattered territories. We should divide and place controls over the countries and vigorously cultivate pro-China forces. Without such forces, he says, China will find itself encircled and besieged, even if the South China Sea is under our control. And I think he was a prominent thinker. By no means did he represent, China's direction, but he was proposing where the grand strategy should go at the time. And it's interesting, when I was asking questions in China about grand strategy, a lot of academics referred me back to, you should read the general's essay from 2001, Liu Yazhou. But then over time, this debate continued internally, and eventually things clearly did change with China's grand strategy, and it's become evident under Xi Jinping. But within the military, they were starting to talk about basing and the need to project force in order to develop into a great power, which is something that all great powers have done as they developed. There was a Rear Admiral Yin Zhou who proposed that if we're going to have something like a base to project force, what we need is a dual-use facility. And he proposed that in 2010. Then the argument moved further on, and there was direction given, apparently, to establish bases in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. But I think the understanding within the PLA is that that's probably not acceptable in a lot of the countries where we want to operate. So dual-use facilities were by far the more useful way to do it, because it's not as clear. It's impossible to prove that it is a military facility anyway. And so eventually, in 2016, we see Admiral Sun Jianguo, who wrote an article where he said that the PLA by this stage was steadily advancing the construction of overseas bases to enhance their overseas positioning. So I'll just give that to you as a bit of background. When people are talking about bases, I don't think what the PLA is currently looking for is a base as it's known in Western countries. It's not an overt military capability. It's more one of these dual-use facilities, which basically is a commercial facility to start with. And it's something that generally would be built by a Chinese company and be used for commercial purposes, but one day could be used for something military. And when I say military, I'm not talking about fighting a war. I'm talking about just what we're doing at the moment in what gets referred to as a phase of competition, where from a military point of view, it's projecting force for humanitarian assistance, for evacuation operations, or stabilisation operations, that kind of stuff, many of which would be considered to be acceptable or beneficial to the host nation. So that's my conception of what a dual-use facility is. But I would say to you that there is a number of those that have been developed within the region now. And that picture in the middle at the top is one of the examples that caused a lot of stir in the media, and people were talking about a base. It's the wharf at a place called Luganville in Vanuatu. And yes, it was extended by the Shanghai Construction Group in 2017. That in itself doesn't make it a dual-use facility. It was more the story that followed on, where the Chinese ambassador was trying to convince the Prime Minister of Vanuatu to use it for some other purposes that led to that labelling of it as a dual-use facility. Once again, happy to discuss that more in questions. So back to the term that I gave you at the beginning, grand strategy being the integration of statecraft to achieve long-term goals. What I've just been talking about is the change in Chinese statecraft across all its different means that's been very evident from 2017 through to now. The argument before 2017 was that China had no real interest in the Pacific. It's fairly clear from the change in statecraft over this last period of time that China does have a strong interest in the Pacific. And that's probably pretty obvious to all of you by now. I'm not telling you anything particularly exciting. But the last thing that I just want to discuss is that, and I've been painfully aware of this throughout all of my research, there is a lot of different interests in the Pacific Islands and particularly in Melanesia that exist on those different levels. And when I start with the Peli Hau'afa's idea that the Pacific exists on two different levels of operation, I take that even further into, in the last decade, we've seen a very strong regionalism led by the Pacific, by the PIF, and developing things like the 2050 strategy for the PIF. There's been very strong agency from a number of different nations within the Pacific, where in each case, despite the competition from external powers, each country has made choices to try and advance its national interests, which every country should. And I think there was probably once an assumption that there might not have been the capacity or the capability to do that. But I think it's very evident that there's a lot of very bright people in each of the countries that I have had a relationship with who have been able to see this coming, understand what it could mean for their country, and be in this interesting position where they make choices described as a hedging strategy, but it's ultimately it's about their interest. So in terms of Solomon Islands, we're talking about your interest as a nation. But then when you look below that level, and this is going into that second level that Hau'afa talked about, there's different interests at provincial level, and there's different interests at the grassroots level. And the confusing thing is that all four of those levels in relation to one place and one issue could have different interests to each other. And I find that really problematic. And that causes friction, it causes problems. And the biggest issue is for external countries like China, like America, like Australia, who don't understand that. Because you live in it, you understand it. But it's the people who come from other countries who struggle to understand what does that mean. And I think that that's something that all of us need to be very aware of as we develop into the future. And that concludes my presentation, I think just about on time. And I don't know if we want to have a break, Professor, before we go to Q&A?
Pete, you touched on quite a number of things. I think we'll go straight into Q&A if you don't mind. But I would like to first of all thank you for that presentation and contextualizing some important relationships. Just listening to your presentation, it also dawned on me that when you evaluate what national interest and what other countries have, you could probably also make the same argument for all the other states that we have relationships and partnerships with, in that Great Britain have their own national interests to pursue. Australia also have their own national interest in which they pursue. And so you could probably also categorize in terms of all the statecraft that goes on, that you've got these economic and political issues, all of which permeate in different approaches. I guess it's just the way countries have in their approach that is different. And so we've had long-standing relationships with many different countries. And of course, China's involvement in the countries is far more recent. But I guess for many of us in the islands, and for me particularly as a Solomon Islander, I often see, as you mentioned right at the end of your talk, see things through what our own lenses are. And I remember when the American hospital ship visited last year, I think it was. And then soon after that, the Chinese medical team visited again in November. Two same medical teams, hospital boats that came to provide a service. But the level of social media commentary on both of these vessels differed. And my response as a Solomon Islander on the ground was that, for me, what is more important is not the color of where what we're getting comes from, but the service that we get from. Because if we can't get medicine from the hospitals, if we can't get Panadol, then our people really don't care where it comes from. And I guess at the end of the day, for us, for me, speaking personally as a Solomon Islander, what is important in our relationship with any of our countries, whether it's been Australia or Great Britain or the United States, or if it's China, it's ensuring that our national needs also are met, and particularly working together to improve both the social and economic outcomes of the countries. I guess that is what many of our people, they look at, not really where the color of the, and I've just come to realize that more recently, that it's not the color and the flag that flies behind the aid that is important to us, but what we can actually also get out and help improve our economic and social outcome. But I would like to thank you very much in contextualizing that, that relationship between and China's interest, which listening to the analysis can also be applied to all the other countries that we have relationships with. I'd now like to open the floor for some questions and invite questions from, yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Let's go. I moved from the Chinese Embassy as I talked to the professor and other colleagues here. Professor, first of all, I'm from the Chinese Embassy. I have to express formally disagreement with my views. Just color mine China and Taiwan with different colors. I have to do that. Okay. So, Professor, you mentioned that.
Just stand back a bit, mate.
Okay. You mentioned that. I also want to answer one of your questions. You just mentioned about some ambassador, Chinese ambassador here have some PET, deputy general background. So I just want to first clarify that actually almost every Chinese ambassador oversight have that kind of background. Personally, I believe the reason that nowadays we just have something like 200 ambassador position oversight, but we have so many staff in your foreign ministry. So if we don't reach that ambassador with a certain level, maybe we have too much people for two less positions. Okay. So I just arrived here for something like less than 1 month. Maybe it's shorter than the time you stay here. But I really see some different pictures here. So just around this place, China. And some Solomon friends told me that it's one of the most advanced in the region and helps them a lot for their Pacific beings. And just hundreds of meters away, I believe that there is a dormitory building, just also made by China.
And also, I think, is this book?
That's aid by China and also welcomed by the teachers and students here. So just when you look at China Solomon Corporation and our main focus is on the development and the practical issues. That's also true for China's relations with some other Pacific Island countries. So you also mentioned about the financial burdens for the countries here. So to my knowledge, at least to Solomon Islands, most of our cooperation is China's aid, something like 90%. I don't know the exact name. And it's, for the loans, this portion is very small. And those loans, we give the loan here, not for the salaries here, just to some very pragmatical projects here. So like the SINU project, like some roads, this project are income generating project. I firmly believe this will not cause any burden to the countries here. And another issue that we talk about is security cooperation here. I don't know, for me, I don't know other countries' situations, but in Solomon Islands, until now, we only have 10 policemen here, only very small number. So I don't know whether they are capable to influence or to affect the country's future. Anyway, but they are working very hard to help the police here with some training programs and some China aid equipment, police equipment, and actually to comfort some others concerned, we strictly limit those police equipment to very basic ones, such like boots, like ties, like helmets, like shields, narrow weapons, to very limited to those very basic ones. So just we come here and try to smile to everyone, try to be polite to everyone, because that we do not want to argue or to compete with others. We just, on the contrary, we are happy to see some kind of cooperations with others. For example, that we are planning to build a downtown road in Oki City of Malaya province. And we are very happy to see and hear some other countries also planning to build some projects, some roads that are connecting with Oki City. And we are happy to hear that. And if possible, we are also happy to see whether we can have a kind of third-party cooperation with that. Because that's good for the Solomon country, good for the Solomon people, and good for every other country. So, Professor, you talked about the grand strategy or China's interest or China's intention here. Right? I think that for that part, we should go to the very basic and very fundamental issue. That is that we are living in a more and more interdependent world, and our future are deeply connected. So when some parts of the world they have crises, I know we are having. I don't want to say the name, but so we also suffer some food and energy crisis here. So when some other parts of the world their economy boost, I also don't know what to say the name, but we also have a better development here. So I mean that Solomon and some other Pacific Island countries, their development helps others' development. Their security helps others' security. So that's the very core part of the vision that a shared future for mankind. And to make it very easy and to make it very simple, it's just the Solomon Islands program, you meet together. I think one of the meaning is that helping others is just helping yourself. Thank you all. Okay, thank you so much.
And of course, as both the university and the country, we all appreciate the enormous contribution that not just China makes, but every country have made in the development of Solomon Islands, and that includes Australia and New Zealand. So, I mean, we have not and we will not forget all of that. What is more important for us, just is to address our young people on the floor, is that you need to and we need to think and define our own national interest, and therefore pursue our own national interest as to what is important for us. Most importantly, whether it's this institution, and we do really appreciate the support that we're getting from and the partnerships that we're actually developing with the Oceans University of China and Jiangsu Agriculture Academy, but also we deeply appreciate and value the partnership that we are going to be developing with DFAT as well. So we're signing an agreement on the 15th of March, and I'll be going to Canberra next week and meeting also with DFAT, because I value that everyone has a role and an interest and a stake in this university to support us. But at the end of the day, for all of us, our young people, we must know what we want for our country. And what we want for our country is to help improve our economic and social well-being, help us achieve greater economic growth. So there's more disposable income that our young people can find work and jobs. And that is why at the university we are very strongly emphasizing that you go out with global employability skills. So thank you, sorry for that, but you can, you can respond, and I'm sure there must be other questions from the floor as well. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your comments. If I can just make a few quick responses to what you said. Firstly, you associated what I said with China creating an economic burden. I don't recall ever saying that, and that was not, if that's how it came across, that's not what I was saying. What I was talking about was the costs for a number of Chinese projects being borne by multilateral banks. And those are banks like the Asian Development Bank, where most of their money comes from Japan, from the United States, from Australia. So other sources of money, right? People outside the Belt and Road, and that's where that money's coming from. So when something's paid for by the Exim Bank from China, absolutely, it's your money. But when it's the ADB or the World Bank, it's not China's money. That's all I was saying. And that there has been a rising number of projects being paid for by multilateral banks ever since 2018. And I believe that is starting to happen in the Solomons. But an important thing associated with that, and back to Professor Transform's original remarks as well, absolutely. There's a number of Chinese projects that have made a very important contribution to the infrastructure in this country and in the other countries I've done my research in. And I wouldn't for a moment try to take that away from you. And I think, back to Professor Transform's point, that is in the interest of the country that we're in, because in order to develop, you need to have options and you need to have the cheapest possible infrastructure. And China has been good at representing that at times. So, I have no issue with you there. In terms of the Deputy Director General thing for ambassadors, it could be my maths is poor, but my understanding when I counted through the number of those positions in the MFA versus the number of ambassadors in the world, there's a lot more ambassadors than there are DDGs. And that's what I base my analysis on that particular point. In terms of security cooperation, I just need to pick you up on one point, and my background is military, so clearly this is something I've had something to do with, but there's been a number of times where China has delivered weapons into the Pacific now. The first time was in Timor-Leste in 2017, but there was a substantial shipment of weapons and armoured personnel carriers into Papua New Guinea just before APEC, which was interesting. One of the pictures on my slide that I didn't mention was one of those armoured personnel carriers. So there has been a contribution in that regard from China, and I think it's important to note that. As for the police, in particular the police that are in this country, they have certainly grown their presence. I said it was originally 9. I believe they were more than 24 or so during the Pacific Games last year. I don't know what they're at now, but they are a sizable contingent on the ground, and they have a lot of influence here in the Solomon Islands. And so just back to something that Professor Transform said at the beginning, which I completely agree with, and that is that every country in this region needs to be looking out for its own national interest, and that involves engaging with various other powers from outside the region. And I think that should be expected, and I completely expect it myself. So thank you so much for you've really added to this presentation with your questions. Does anyone else have a question or a comment they'd like to make?
All right. Well, thank you very much for your talk. I truly appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah. I think these are more of curiosities rather than a question.
Yep.
And that is that when Solomon Islands switch political allegiance from Taiwan
Yep.
to China,
Yeah.
there's a big hue and cry about it.
Yeah.
Media was here, everyone. Not only that, but US, Australia, England, and New Zealand sort of got together and said we got to do something. It's like tightening up their, opening their embassies here. And not only that, but Japan did the same thing. And also India, which in my recollection never showed any interest in Solomon Islands, suddenly opened an embassy here. My point is, why is that? I mean, if like, in accordance with what you say, if China is going to help us, why are these countries, these superpowers, doing that? I mean, are they reading something into a social discourse? What's not really there? Or is this part of an international paradigm of some kind that when the country comes into another country, superpower, they got together and do something? Are they reading too much into it? Or is there some kind of paradigm that ordinary folks like myself, we don't see?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll do my best to just kind of relay. So what the gentleman here has just said is he's surprised when Solomon's switched from recognising Taipei to Beijing in 2019, the way it has affected Solomon Islands' relationships with other external countries. Would that be fair to say? And that in particular, a number of the major powers in the world have become concerned and become far more interested in Solomon Islands. And I think that last point, the far more interested in Solomon Islands, really gets back to what Professor Transform was saying before, which is in that way it's kind of good for Solomon Islands in that if you can get more interest and get more people contributing to what's in your national interests, well that's got to be a good thing, right? Well, it's good for you.
Is it the reason?
Hey?
Is it the reason then?
Is it the reason? So why are those external countries concerned? Is that the question?
It seems to me, I have my, I think as political science, I have my own theory about it.
Yeah.
And I think it's not so much development, but more strategic power.
Most what?
Strategic.
Strategic. Yes.
Your area.
Yes.
Yeah.
No. So look, I think we're on the same page, and that is so. My answer to him would be that a lot the external countries that have taken issue with the development of China's statecraft on the ground here in the Solomons are competing with China. And despite what the gentleman says, I think China's competing with them. I think we can all accept that. The interesting point that you've brought up in your question is that along the way, maybe not always, but at least to start with, there's been some benefit to Solomons in that it's getting more people interested and it's getting more contributions coming in. The question remains whether Solomon Islands can maintain control over those contributions, I guess, is the final thing as to whether it does in the end meet national interest. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So maybe just to contribute to this dialogue. So what has happened, just to put things in context, is that since the end of the Second World War until recently, the predominant powers in our region have been Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Our region has been the area of influence in which no one else has had to come in. China is a new development partner, and therefore it has changed the dynamics of the political configuration of the region. And to upset a comfort zone, if you've been working for the last 70 or so years where you have dominated, and all of a sudden you've got this new development partner come in, of course it is unsettling. And it is not just unsettling in the Pacific, it's unsettling globally, because China has emerged as a major development partner in the global development landscape, where their influence parallels that of the United States and the Western countries. So it is a real change in the political dynamics of the global structure, in which we are also very much part of it. So the real issue for us is that it is here to stay. China is not going to go away from the region. They are a major development partner, just as Australia, New Zealand, and all the other countries are a major development partner for the country. And the real issue for Solomon Islands and any of the Pacific Island countries is how to use that new dynamic and influence that dynamic so that at the end of the day, the hospitals get built as a least developed country and one of the poorest in the region, that we must be able to leverage the relationship that we have with Australia, with the United States, and with China to help build our infrastructure in the outer islands, our communication, that is very much needed to help develop the economic growth. That, to me, is really the strategy for the country. And at the end of the day, it is up to us to be able to how to define that. The answer to your question is simply that. I went to the officer in charge of the US and China in DFAT in Canberra. And he simply told me that this is our area of influence and our region. And of course, from a geostrategic perspective, from a defense posture, we are the line of defense for Australia and New Zealand. The arc, the Melanesian arc, is the most important strategic area for Australia. There's no doubt about that. This is where the Japanese were turned back. So from a military perspective and posture, there is no doubting that Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and that this particular arc represents the single most important strategic area for Australia. And that's why you've got these dynamics at play. But as I said, it's not going to go away because China is now a very important development partner for the region. On that note, I'm sure there must be some questions from a student somewhere, and maybe a female student. Sure, you must be interested.
Can I just say something? I'd just like to say that, as usual, Professor Transform has answered that question far more eloquently than I ever could. So thank you, Professor. And I hope that answers your question sufficiently, sir. So, any others? Doesn't have to be a question, it could be a comment. Anything you want to discuss?
Nation, humanities. The level of discussion that we're having now is too abstract for the ordinary Solomon Islanders. There to speak as an ordinary Solomon Islander. I drive from White to here every morning, and I see that road construction every day, and I question my reaction to all the work, everything, all the effort, the people that put effort, hard work into the construction. And I compare myself to ordinary Solomon Islanders. I ask the question, how do the ordinary Solomon Islanders feel about this? How did they feel about the stadium? How did the ordinary Solomon Islanders feel about all the grant projects that is going on around us? I ask the question. I ask the question, how do Solomon Islanders, the ordinary Solomon Islanders that do not understand abstract discussions around all these strategic relationships that is going on around us? And I am interested to know where are Solomon Islanders in everything that is going on, the ordinary Solomon Islanders. And I'm interested to know the kinds of questions that they are asking. My question is, with the work that you are doing, where are the ordinary Pacific Islanders or Melanesians' voice in the kind of study that you are doing? Because I wonder so many times how Melanesians, how Pacific Islanders, and how the ordinary Solomon Islanders think about everything that is going on and their reactions to that. I wonder if somehow, somewhere along the way in the study, that ever came up something that needs to be considered. I speak as an ordinary Solomon Islander. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a very good question. What does this mean for ordinary people in the Solomons, but also in Melanesia? And to answer part of your question, it certainly did come up a lot in the first half of my research. That was kind of where I was focused. And at the time, a lot of this kind of higher level state stuff, there really wasn't much to talk about. And I was more interested in the grassroots level interactions, which were more about, with the Chinese, it was private business, small business on the ground, of which there is much, and it was growing. And the way that they interacted with Pacific Islanders was originally something that I spent a lot of time researching. Then as time went on, because I spent so long doing this, I'm just a bit slow, but I spent so long doing it, then all of the state level things started to change. And in the end, that's what my thesis became about. But to get back to your very important point, originally it was far more focused on those issues, and it is so complex, it's hard to know where to go, because when I was in one place, the issues were different to another place, And so I got to a point where, say I'd find an island where there had been some difference of interest, let's say, and I'd try to understand it from a number of different perspectives to get a holistic picture, the best one that I could. And in the end, you know, that's resulted in, there is a number of places that I've tracked where just at that low level, Chinese local businesses, small businesses, private businesses, there are a couple of places where they have been evicted and are not allowed to be there anymore. And that was purely because, nothing to do with, you know, higher level strategy, nothing to do with nationality. It was to do with the interest of the people. And so in these couple of places that I looked at, it was to do with ultimately protecting local interests. It was about, how to describe this, a concern with land ownership and with business, the success of local businesses, being, so the microeconomy, local microeconomy, being threatened by competition at that level locally, and had a profound result, much like in reference to Apelli Halfa's words about that other level, that lower level of operation in the Pacific. So absolutely fascinating stories, which I have not written about. The one thing I do find about all that is, I think it can be misunderstood if you talk about it outside the perspective of that place and through the eyes of those people. But in those examples that I came to understand, it was partly a symptom of a larger number of Chinese families migrating to the Pacific to make their own living. Like many families had done before them. But there's just a much greater influx in the last 20 years. And so quite often around the islands, we call them the new Chinese. But you know, generally they have virtually no connection to the Chinese state. They're there for their own interests. But because they're in such a number and they're so competitive, the way that they do their business is very effective. It can become this competition locally for business opportunity and for land ownership. When they kind of come across problems with land ownership, it becomes problematic. So I don't feel like I've done justice to your question, but it's what I'm offering you is a few microcosms that I did come across. It leads me to this overall concern, though, that I mentioned at the end of my presentation, that when people talk about the high-level state stuff and the strategy stuff, they're often not thinking about what's happening here, and they can trip over that really badly. And that's, you know, part of my view and my message, say, at home when I'm talking to officials there, is just think about the kind of local level power structures, you know, strong power structures and the different interests at the micro level. I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's part of the answer.
Thank you. We'll take one more question, but before we do so, I'd like to just not answer, but just to help Lenora. The real issue, Lenora, and for all of us here, the young people, is that what is the government doing about empowering us to participate in the development of our country? You know, increasingly, you and I are bystanders. When you get off the plane at Henderson Airport, from Henderson to White River, how many Solomon Islanders actually own shops and properties? And we are just watching in our own country. And as we approach the next general elections, and that's why all of you who are here today will recall my talk to you last week. What are you doing about it? And for your children, when we are going to be increasingly marginalized from all the economic activities. I've never heard any political party promote affirmative economic policies that would ensure that indigenous Solomon Islanders own or partly own some of these buildings that we see in town, participate in the commercial sector, participate in the exploitation of our own forestry resources. That is a failure of our own people. We can't blame anyone else for the mess that we are in today. We can only blame ourselves. And the longer we stay silent about it, the more our situation is going to get worse and worse. And that is why I appealed to all of you young people last week, and I appealed to you when I spoke to all of you, the student body. Don't stay silent. Don't stay silent. Because when you go out, where are the jobs that are going to be waiting for you? When all the economic and commercial activities you see going on in this town are not being done by us. Why? Because the government, our own people own land, but they can't go to the banks because the banks and the government won't guarantee them a land. But this is not rocket science, my Wantoks. It's not rocket science. If we want to help our people, the government should have done that 20 years ago by making sure that we have policies, that we co-own these buildings. One of the things I suggested to my two colleagues, my two deputies, is that I said, if we were to build another major constructor building on this campus, would it be okay, palatable, if we insist as a university to suggest that the companies that are now dominating, the one who built this and the others, that they get involved in a partnership with a Solomon Island company, so that we co-own these companies that are now building our bridges. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong in the government. In actual fact, I got it on record on the 26th of May, 2020. I saw Manasseh Songovale, and I also saw Jimmy Rogers. And I said to them that our new relationship with China, we have an opportunity to ensure that infrastructure projects that we build, we can insist on developing it as a partnership with them. So there's transfer of knowledge, there's transfer of skills. We can also insist on ensuring that procurements are done through our local companies, so that there's investment and flow, cash flow into the economy. And this was a time when we were going into COVID, and nothing was done about it. And increasingly, you and I are just spectators in our own capital, in our own country. And no one is saying anything about it. But that, Lenora, is the simple answer to your question. That unless those who are campaigning now and contesting the next elections change this, you and I, our hope and scope for participating in the economy of this country, we're going to be more and more alienated. We cannot shape and influence the economic and the growth of this country when we as resource owners are just mere bystanders. And it makes me really annoyed when I hear all our politicians speak on all these things when developing simple affirmative action. Now, affirmative action is simply this. If you own a piece of land, and many of these land along the road from White River to Henderson, they were owned by indigenous Solomon Islanders. But government had no way of supporting these people. Now just imagine the economic impact that if those buildings were all owned by indigenous Solomon Islanders and rented by others as businesses, the impact in the pockets of people and the communities will be hugely transformative. But we can't shape. And that, unfortunately, is our economic our development pathway. Our economic pathway that our politicians and our leaders have pursued in the last 30 years is one in which you and I are alienated from the economic development and growth of this country. And that, to me, is probably the biggest tragedy that we are facing. And so the challenge is, how can we change all of this? Of course, we're going into the next elections, but it's going to be the same story because no one seems to recognize that this is an issue for the country. And as long as no one recognizes it, and as long as no one, we're going to waste all our time talking. But at the same time, coming back to this important project, it's up to us, as I always said, to define our national interest, to use and leverage that relationship that we have with Australia, with New Zealand, and with China and the US to help us develop and grow and bring intellectual vigor into our society so that we can see the problems that we have. Otherwise, my friends, believe me, if we're not careful, in 10 years' time, our capital city is going to be a city slum. It's going to be a city slum. If we're not starting to now divest some of these important issues and recognize the importance of provincial governments and empower our provincial governments and create jobs that stay in the provinces, this town will be a city slum. Already you can see it. When you drive down in the bus, the huts, the stalls, the bitumen stalls, inside residential areas. It's dirty, and it's not good. And the question I have for us at the university is, what can we do about it? What should we say about it? And we have a responsibility to be able to say and do something about it. Otherwise, we're going to be living in a city slum. And that will be, to me, one of the greatest tragedies, because it's you and your children who will not know what it's like to live in a beautiful place. I grew up in this town. I grew up right in the middle of the town in Point Cruz. And I'm so sorry to say that most of you don't know how beautiful, how nice, how green Honiara's town was, the town that we grew up in. And it's just so sad to see what has happened. And if we don't do anything about it now, which I am not really hopeful, because the damage has already been done. But I do apologize for making that comment. But I think it's important that we do recognize that these things have to happen. But it's important that we recognize that we must develop the partnership with our friends. They are very important for us. If we're going to develop the infrastructure, if we're going to develop our provinces, and our development must go out to the outer islands, to Makira province, to Renola and Bellona, to Isabel, to all these other places. Just concentrating everything in Honiara here, in Honiara, is going to result in the creation of increasing alienation and deprivation of services from the rest of the country. And that, to me, is the greatest security risk that we face in the country. In terms of the security, let me also say, we have security arrangements with Australia, the Defence Force Corporation. We have a status of forces agreement also with the United States. So it's not unusual that we do have a security arrangement with China to support our services. So in terms of our diplomatic posture, but no one really is aware of all these other security agreements that we have. And so on. China's security interest is the one that has actually created a lot more media interest simply because it is China. But I'm aware that we've had for a very long time these other arrangements with Australia and also with the United States, which are very important part of our security apparatus and support for our police. So it's not unique. I think we need to put all of these things into context. I'll take one more question and then we will maybe, there was a question at the back there. I think, was it you, Ernest, or someone else?
First of all, I'm a student. I saw this talk in Facebook, social media, so I presentation. Thank you very much. talks, and I think I read last week, transform our people to international university as well, doing a presentation here. So SINU is coming up. That's a good sign. Congratulations. Secondly, it's encouraging to encourage this kind of culture. Nation talking to each other is very good. Though there are a lot of issues, through this kind of seminars, we try to come with some kind of solutions. Okay, I have several questions, but I'd rather not ask them because we have a limited time. So I'll just ask one. In your opinion, I understand that the way you talk, you have a lot of background in military intelligence. Solomon Islands doesn't have intelligence organization by itself. Some years ago, before Ramsey came into the country, there's a unit in the police called SP, called Special Branch. And the unit, the way it is set up is very different. Briefings and all the things were done by the director of SP, direct to the Prime Minister of Somalia. So there is no interference whatsoever along the way. So at the moment, we have a unit called NIU, situated in Robe, but it's basically not good, sort of like political intelligence or that. It's basically just for crime intelligence. So Somaliland is missing out a lot on that particular thing. So in other words, we are not independent in our decision making. We are not informed in our decision making because we are missing a big part. So I'm not really sure with the political parties which one is in its policy is trying to incorporate this in their policy. But I think this is very important. The foreign policy of Solomon Islands is friends to all, enemy to none. And I think this sort of like captures what the transform said earlier on, which is we're trying to do things according to our national interest. There are many development partners which we will be working with. We sort of like be happy to work with them. But at the end of the day, we want to promote our national interest. So what do you think? Do you think it's a must for Solomon to have a dedicated organization just concentrating on intelligence, just like Australia and other countries? Because at the moment it's missing. So the decision making of our political leaders are not informed. It's sort of like we are not sort of like decision making. It's being influenced by different parties. So,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. You're specifically asking about the need for an intelligence organisation to inform the government as opposed to just internally in the police force. Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. Sorry, that's not much of an answer, but I tend to agree. Most other Pacific Islands where I'm familiar with their government, they have such an organisation in some way. But sometimes it kind of straddles between police and the government, but generally it services that need for political decision makers. So that's my perspective, but I tend to agree with you. Thank you for your question.
You were with us to presenting the same paper, and all along I've been thinking about that. Now, what you said is true, and said by Transformed, our Vice Chancellor, that
when you talk about statecraft, every country that enters Solomon Islands, they have their own statecraft. And behind those statecraft lies their own interests.
Yes.
Now, your presentation today was about the PRC, and we're talking about the statecraft. Now, one of the things that many people in this country were asking, they were asking about, this infrastructure that we currently have. And I do affirm that we really need those infrastructure, like the one that we have down here, the National Stadium. And currently in Auki, we are looking forward to have New Tassie Road in Auki. And people are really excited about it. And from another lens, or on the same line, people describe it as gifts. They are gifts to us. Now, the question is around the dynamics of gift. Now, from the classical theory of gift, it is not a one-way process. It is reciprocal. It has three forms to it. That is the principle of giving, the principle of receiving, and the principle of returning. These are the three classical theories around gift giving. And Solomon Island is a very small country with a very small economy, and we really do not have every resources, and we rely very much on friends coming in, bigger friends, small friends. Now we have very big friends there with us. Now we are very small, and we are so worried about the gift coming in. Whether those gifts, they will purely gift, or they have to abide by those principles that I was talking about today. That there is, at some point, there will be the complete cycle of reciprocity. The principle of giving, that is one way. The principle of receiving, we are very happy, but again, the principle on the demand that we have to return it. Those are some of the critical aspects of what we are receiving. So while on the other side, we are very happy that we have received all these things, are we going to sit and appreciate them, or one day we could come back and say, we need something in return for these gifts? These are some of the underlying issues, critical thinking that people are thinking about. But the ordinary Solomon Islanders, we really don't, think about those things, reciprocity and the dynamics around it. We just appreciate that we have, very beautiful, steady land here, and very soon in Auki, ordinary people will appreciate, driving in almost like 30 kilometers past the road, and those things. So I'm just, trying to draw your attention to those dynamics. Thank you.
It's clear that Solomon's really needs the contributions that it's getting. I think that every country that is making contributions understands the situation here and that it's needed. As you say, every country does statecraft. That's how it works. Even the Solomon Islands does. And it's how you work in other countries. The question is there a difference between countries in how that set of three operates, as you described with the gift? And that's for you to judge, not for an outsider like me. But I think it's a very, very important question to ask, and there is always that potential that there are strings attached to a gift. And I think the important thing is to have smart, discerning people running your country to make those decisions. Ones that you trust. Thank you, Tomas.
Please, if I can invite all of you to join me again in expressing our appreciation to Pete. I'd like to thank Pete. I'd like to thank also representatives from the Australian High Commission for the valuable partnership that we've developed, and also encourage others here who will be who will participate with us on this important seminar series. I thank all of you, the students and the staff, and those of you from outside who have come in. As I said, this is the perfect place, and I hope that we can grow the university into a place where we can bring in all people and listen to all the ideas, because there's no other forum like this in the country, in the town, and I'm sure there is a thirst amongst our own people for us to be able to come in and at least share some ideas, whether it's from people like yourself, Pete, but also from our own people in the country who I know have a lot of very good ideas. And at this point in time and at this stage of our development, our country really needs all of the intellectual vigor and rigor and help in terms of ideas to help build our country and build and improve the economic and social well-being of the country. And I see that the university has a responsibility to bring in all these people to help galvanize. We are the interface between different governments, between industry, and especially our young people. And those of you in the forum, I cannot emphasize enough how important this is for you young people who are here, because I would like you have a responsibility. Take these things seriously, because at the end of the day, it is your future, as I keep saying, and those of your children that you must work really hard to improve. Otherwise, if you just leave things as they are, the life and environment that you're going to go out to is not going to be the life and environment that some of us grew up in. And we want you to grow up and live in an area that is important. I first visited China in 2012, well before the switch. And I recognized then and there the importance of China and the value that China had and the role that it was playing in the global economy. I also wrote a paper before the switch about the implications of the switch. And in that paper, I underlined that at the end of the day, the responsibility to shape that relationship is up to us. And it's up to you, the young people and students, to help country and help us shape that relationship. We are building very important relationships now with Australia, with our people are working there from the villages now. We've got more than 100 students now studying in China. All of these exposure and relationships are going to create important dynamics that will come to help us develop the country. I don't want all of you, our young people, to fall into the trap that many of our people and graduates have fallen into, and that is to create corrupt, corrosive society. And that is a sad and tragic consequence that I'm seeing, where you now have to bribe. And these are educated people that are doing these things. And I would discourage and strongly encourage all of us. The reason why I have taken a very strong stance against corruption and trying to promote good governance, because at the end of the day, it is our people that we undermine and affect. The services that we give to the hospital. It's not different people. Own brothers and sisters, believe me, and therefore I would like all of us. The education that we get in Australia, here at SINU, is an education that would actually help all of us to contribute meaningfully to the development of the country. I know things are difficult for us, they are very difficult, but we live in a country that is rich in resources, there's land, there's sea, and therefore there is really no reason for us to be in the economic situation we are in now. But it is what it is, and we have a responsibility to work closely with Australia, with New Zealand, with the United States, with China, and all of our partners to help us develop our economy. So on that note, let me just once again thank each one of you, thank the organizers, Darius and Cyprian, and I thank also Shadrach, the Pro Vice Chancellor, corporate, and all of you who have made time to come in. So on that note, I wish you all well, a blessed week, and I look forward to our next seminar.